I usually am closer to my audience, so and I do like to walk around. So, at any rate, I'm so delighted that you all could come today. This is a topic that has inspired me for several years, and it is one that I think has great import in the nation and in the world. What I'd like to do today is share with you why I did it and some of the conclusions I drew. And mostly what I want to do is leave you with a sense of being able to look at problems from a bigger perspective. To say, it's not just isolated, it's not just one person, it's not just one company, it's not just the greed of some executive or some government official or some policy, it's many things. And in order to do that and capture it, I used what's called systems thinking. So I'm hoping to engage you in systems thinking, and I would like to have it very open. Questions, comments, contradictions. If you don't agree, just please speak up, because I love that kind of dialogue. Before we start, I will introduce myself, and I want to say thank you to University of Idaho and to the Claremont Graduate University for sponsoring this event. Mary Lee and Eric have come from Moscow, Idaho, and have done a lot of work to set it up remotely, which was wonderful because of email. So thank you for coming. My background, many of you already know, but I started at University of Idaho with a math degree and an electrical engineering degree, so it was really symbol-oriented and everything had answers. A little later, then I began to work after University of Idaho. I worked at the Naval Air Warfare Center in China Lake, California, which is about 2.5 hours from here. Started as an engineer and did a lot of software. I was mostly into computers at the time, did a little bit of hardware for making bombs and missiles, which is what we do there. We have a million acres there that has nothing. So you can bomb the heck out of it. After a while, of course the atmosphere there is extremely technical, as you might imagine, and I was really missing the people side of things. So I decided to come to Claremont Graduate University, and we got a master's, MBA, and a PhD in executive management. Joe Massarello here was my chair of my committee, and I thank him deeply for his interest in systems thinking. And Bob is associated here. We did some work together as well. During the time when I worked at China Lake, I was really lucky to see things that many people would not experience, and I never thought I would even experience them myself. But you were able to take an idea from its very beginning and work through the prototypes and actually into a place where you could do some development of that particular weapon or system. I was very lucky to have done weird things like drive a Russian tank, be on an aircraft carrier with a bunch of young kids who were just very gung-ho and loved every minute of what they were doing. Flew upside down in an F-18. Just many things that have allowed me to open my eyes, I guess, to the world. And I think my first time I started an interest in systems thinking big picture perspective, when I was project manager of the Sidewinder missile program, in which when we had a test, oftentimes they would fail. Not often, but sometimes they would fail, which you learned more from the failures than you did from the successes. And it allowed me in those pressure-filled times to understand that it wasn't just one person, one discipline, one thing that made the system work. It was everybody. Everyone had to do his or her part, and it was an extremely tight-knit, and it was a system, basically. And then, of course, working on my dissertation. It was a huge system. I worked at Texas Instruments, and Joe is a big systems person, so we got along very well. So what I'd like to start with is just talk about the financial crisis that happened in 2008, and just get a sense from you of your participation or your thoughts about it. And please, I encourage you to just spout out. What interested me was actually I was able to teach a 3-hour session in a class that we had at Claremont Graduate University, where I'm currently adjunct professor. And the class, Joe ran the class at the time, and he said, well, you can pick anything you want. What do you want to talk about? And make it applicable to Peter Drucker. So I picked system thinking. And I looked around and I said, what's the worst problem that I could possibly capture with systems thinking? And it happened to be the financial crisis. So I wrote a little paper on it and presented it, and gave it to my students. And that really started the book. So I just want to get a sense from you of the 2008 financial meltdown. Where were you? How did it happen? What happened to you? Did you know it was coming? So anyone who wants to share with me what they were doing, or yeah.
We knew it was going to come. Paul Wheeler, I'm an architect, and do shopping centers and houses and all sorts of things. We planned for it. We didn't overextend. I bonused my people rather than gave them high salaries. We had saved, but we didn't know it was going to be this bad. So we since ran through the cash that we had. We borrowed against our house and life insurance. What caused it was stupid, cheap money for people. There's a certain class of people that shouldn't be borrowing, that shouldn't have the responsibility of living in a house, and the government thought they all should. And you could fog a mirror and they'd give you a loan.
Okay, all right, that's wonderful input, and certainly part of what happened. So and you had some personal emotional experience, obviously, with that. Anyone else?
The question of whether you think it's over, I don't think it's over, to your point, because I see the same behaviours popping up again. And I also see the government largely putting band-aids over the problem to try and remedy the problem. So I don't like to be pessimistic. I think that's not always healthy, but I'm not convinced that we're anyway out of the woods. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Anyone? Any other thoughts? You were in Italy, you said.
So when we were in Italy, that was, I think, a trailing indicator of seeing the market crash. But leading indicators were a lot more, in the banking industry, a lot more ad hoc stories of just overt greed by executives who were milking the system. The government requiring us to get out, clearly there was not good enough qualification by the borrower. And a little out of control mentality. I think people are not using integrity in their decision making. So those were probably leading indicators, which were the puffs of smoke before the fire.
Just two things. I'm old-fashioned enough so that when I went through this banking stuff, we had a whole course in credits and collection, and character and capacity and things were. It sounds like very old stuff, but it was at the heart of the bottom of this. The second thing, we were in Hong Kong at the time. I was teaching for a week when the global effects began to sit in. Holy cow. Here we were teaching, and I was wishing I was selling everything, when I felt too far away. And it was global. The markets all over the world were reacting to what was a Swiss, the Swiss bank, the UBS, kind of unfolded it a little bit, and then voila.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was it was sort of a surprise. And I think, if you think about like before 2003, I just put this as a date, I had not heard of MBSs or CDOs or CDSs or subprimes. I didn't even know what that was. Did anyone here know, maybe your finance area?
Well, I did, because I was an immigrant. And I was told I was subprime, but I didn't know what that meant. Because I didn't have FICO score, but I had no idea what FICO score or subprime was.
Well, I guess we talked a little bit about what caused it. Do you think it's over? Any indication? indications that we're done, or we're on the next wave. I don't know. It's hard to predict that, but I see that we haven't really changed our mode of operation, essentially. We're still doing Band-Aids. We're not fixing the problems. So I'll just move on, and these were the questions that kind of made me think about it and how I could present it. It is highly complex, multiple interdependencies, and it didn't happen overnight. It absolutely did not. So I thought it had to be looked at as a system, and it had to be, to decomplexify it, we had to look at it step by step, which is how the book is organized. Just chapter by chapter, building, 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 saying this is the problem here, or the problem here, the problem here. And I took a 16-year time span from 1994 to 2010. I looked at statistics there just to say, when did it start? Of course, it started before that, and I'll share that with you too, but though, about 1994, things were fairly stable as they've been for a while, and then we had inflation, and then we had many things. We had the internet, the dot-com bubble burst, and many things in 2000, until we get to 2010. So the history that you'll see in the book is essentially that, with something behind it. I love these images. I get my right brain involved sometimes, but I think that systems philosophies are not new. Aristotle, of course, thought about the whole is more than the sum of the parts, or different from the sum of the parts. And the Chinese yin and yang, it's the opposites play together. I loved Star Trek, so the Borg cube represented a lot of integration and interdependence. And then in Avatar, the Tree of Souls. So these kinds of themes pervade the environment that we, at least even the fictional environment that we live in. So I thought that would be a good way to present it. Now, just to get you familiar with systems thinking, because that's really that's the lens that I looked through to understand the crisis. There's what's called linear thinking, in which you have cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, and then it's done. If you fix the problems along the way, you think everything is done and it's going to be fine. It's sort of like this dominoes, which I set up. Okay, it's one to the next, to the next, to the next, and it's over. Systems thinking is more this whirligig, I call it, child's thing, where things are connected. And so if you just touch one area, you touch many areas, and they don't stop. They just keep going and going and going, and so you'll see this growth, and then you'll see decline, and it's rapid, and they're all interconnected. So that's the mindset that I'd like to have you consider when you're looking at this, the data and things that I'm going to present. I'm not going to do a lot of in-depth data presentation. You can read the book because it's kind of dry. But I will give you some of the major points that I gleaned from it. And also just setting you up for how systems thinking really applies to this particular problem. As we know that there were a lot of growth loops, like housing prices. They kept rising, 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 and then they would fall, 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 so it growth or decay. The balancing loops maintain equilibrium, and I'll share with you all this means is that some things prevent change. And for example, or they drive things toward a certain goal. American culture is one of them. It drives the way we value things toward consumption, for example. There are lags between when policies happen, like monetary policy, and when it really takes effect, 2 or 3 years. You can imagine if you say, I'm going to fix that, but it really doesn't kick in until 2 years later, it's very difficult to predict what's going to help. Habits, preferences lead to cultures. And then there are limits to how high prices can go, how high debt can go, how much secrecy you can actually have when people will be very greedy. There's a limit to it, and that's the sense that I'd like to impart with looking at the whole environment, the economic environment. So what I did in the book was separate the thoughts behind it into two areas. One is very mechanistic oriented. It's the policies, it's the things that drive economics. It's the supply and demand. It's those things that drive economics and the environment. And the other half is the yin, or the human behaviors. And to me, what I'm asking, are they complementary or synergistic, or do they conflict? In my mind, they conflicted. The behavior of human beings, which was driven in part by the economic mechanisms like policies, buy a house, you can afford it, it's okay, drove human behaviors, and they didn't get the best out of humans. They got the worst. And so then the human behaviors overrode monetary policy. If Ben Bernanke, or at the time, was trying to do something with the money side of things, reduce interest rates and so on, it didn't matter. It wasn't effective. And so we were essentially, as a system, as an economic system, as a world, we were out of balance. So the players, of course, were the external environment. As you know, there was much temptation. Mary Lee asked earlier if people were more greedy. Are they more greedy now than they were? No, I don't believe that. I think that circumstances combined to make them accentuate the greediness that humans have, the self-interested nature of humans. The housing and financial markets, they played a big role. The regulatory agents to borrowers, investors, and human nature was a big, big deal in this whole fiasco. And it affected national and international economies. It sort of was a conspiracy. If you've ever seen Murder on the Orient Express, everybody did it. And so there's not one player, there's no single thing that caused it. There was a huge lack of transparency, and if we go way back, and I'm even thinking, if you go back even to after World War II, when a fellow named William Levitt in New York, after the vets had come home, he invested in property, and he made a killing in selling homes to vets who had been approved for they had a new loan program so they could borrow money to buy homes. And so from 1940, I think it was, to 1960, the home ownership grew from about 40% to 62%, where it stayed pretty consistently. So that kind of spurred on the American dream to say, which I'll talk a little about later, but that was World War II. Then in 1965, Johnson's policy for low-income housing started kicking in, and every president thereafter, it was not Republicans or Democrats, it was nearly every president after, maybe not Reagan, but said boost up low-income loans, banks. The HUD, he said, you need to make more loans to subprime loans, you need to make more loans to low-income people. And so it was way back there that started this really get going, maybe slowly at first. And then human nature, greed, desires, we all want to have more, everybody wants to have more. Executive compensation, of course, has gone out of line, perhaps. American and corporate cultures, which are very deep, really spoke about entitlement, consume more, since President Eisenhower suggested that it was Americans' duty from World War II to get us to buy more, to get our country out of the ditch. So it became not just a desire, it became a duty to consume. And so you have this background of consumption, of things that promoted greed and entitlement, and then it affected, of course, it affected the international economies. In 2008, for example, the U.S. debt, if we talk about U.S. debt only, it was only $9.2 trillion. 2 years later, 2010, it was 14 trillion. We bailed ourselves out. And then, of course, now everybody's griping about it. It's almost 17 trillion. That's gross. In just those few years, the percentage increase is amazing. So if we look at, if we take a step back and say, well, where did it all start? We look at the housing. This is where it started. And of course, as I alluded to, it's not just because we have bad people saying, I'm going to have a house. I'm entitled to own a house. The thing that happened is you can see all the way from even like 1996 relative to inflation, the housing prices increased tremendously. The year 2000 is the year where it is about 100, just over 100, and the house price index, excuse me. And you can see it just went way out of line until houses were 86% higher than they had been when the period started. That's huge in those few years. So let's say, well, why did that happen? Who did that? So let's just look at the environment from 1994 to 2004. Interest rates were low, moderate to low. Housing prices had been going up since the 40s. You had a few little blips here and there, but people got confident and they said, oh, well, they're going to go up. They'll go up forever. Non-prime loans, including the subprimes to people with low incomes and not very much to qualify them, were gaining popularity. New home sales were up. Unemployment was pretty stable. And so people said, oh yay, we're in a good period. Let's invest, let's buy. And furthermore, the government is promoting us to buy more homes. So in that case, then, the interest rates, the mortgage market, there was much competition. And so they came up with these new devices and these new kinds of loans. And the adjustable rate mortgages, for example, that were not very popular before this happened. They were used, but not much. And certainly not in the subprime area. They became more popular because more people could buy homes and policies. And then you have what's called securitization, which is just selling these loans as securities. And so all of those things conspired, and it said, okay, credit's easy. The world is good. We have employment. Let's just borrow. And people did. So mortgage loans, total loan originations peaked in 2003, but they were still very high in 2005. This is when the ARM loans, you can see in 2004, the ARMs, the adjustable rate mortgages, were higher than they've ever been. So people could say, oh, I can borrow now at a low rate, and then maybe my house, the price will go up, so I can sell, and I can make money, and everything is just fine. Well, so they said, well, let's do something with those home loans. Let's sell them as securities. And this had happened in the past, but not at this extreme. So you can see that in the trillions of dollars, mortgage-backed securities that were made up of all of those loans just started going up and up. And this is not just, these are people that are investing to make money, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And then those were packaged up again and put into what are called collateralized debt obligations. And that went to billions of dollars across the globe. And you can see how they peaked. You can also see here how they just dropped drastically when many things happened to take the bottom out of the mortgage market, and people just lost money. So you can see they must have lost money. This was a money-making machine, the securities. You had new homes, you had these mortgage-backed securities, and you could make profit, and this was just a nice little machine, and what is called a reinforcing loop, which is nothing more than a growth loop. It says, like a snowball. One thing happens, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and people are making money hand over fist, and then they package those MBSs into the CDOs, and they're making more money, and then they take that and put insurance on it, and everybody's making money. This is wonderful. Let's not stop. Let's keep going. And so what if some of these have the subprime, not very good loans, and it doesn't matter, we're still making money. So this was just an incredible money-making machine. And in the book, I also allude to this as a risk-making machine. And so I have little tigers up there that show that the risk is hidden, but it's cranking along all the time that this money-making machine is. So if we look at the human side and say, oh, well, what were people thinking? Why are you borrowing money when you really can't afford it? Why are people buying these securities when they don't know anything about what's backing them? There was very little information available. So you look way back just to the American culture, and some of this information is from the 1950s that pretty much captures what American culture has evolved to, some of which is entitlement to success. I am entitled to being comfortable, I'm entitled to be equal, I'm entitled to own a home. This became American dream. It gave us the fever of consuming, and it just gave us this, well, this credit is mine. I just have to go out there and get it. It belongs to me. It was like I own it. And then what happened is persistent buying, and now you've got this loop that's buying, buying, buying. So now the expectations, so this is what sets up the buying loop is humans. Expectations, the conditions will continue forever. Housing prices are rising. Everybody's doing it, I'll do it. I'm good and I'm lucky, so it'll continue. And furthermore, and the last one is that borrowers, they'll never default on home loans. That's their home. They would never do that because in the past, the history had been very low percentage of defaults on loans for homes. So people thought, well, it won't happen, so why don't I'll just invest, it's okay, I'm safe. Well, so demand for homes increased, housing prices increased, the expectations of housing prices would increase, drove more demand for homes. So you can see this just snowball, it just goes around and around and around, and that creates growth, and now the housing prices just go up. Because it was also aided by the American culture and by the home buying policies, which we talked about. Now the expectations, this is a continuum that I kind of derived from a bunch of sources. Humans are inclined to, they look at things, they study things, they'll analyze things, or they'll get caught up in the emotion of things. They'll get caught up in the moment. So they may have in the market or in home ownership or whatever, they may start out with a lack of confidence, and then they move to maybe just, I have a little bit of confidence, maybe a little overconfident, and so they'll buy things that maybe aren't good to buy or good investments, and then they get to what state is called irrational exuberance, which is, this was a Greenspan term. They're crazy. They just get caught up in the excitement and enthusiasm, so they will do things that are not very rational. So what happened was we saw unethical behavior everywhere, because people were so caught up in this, I can make money, it's safe, this is a wonderful time of my life, it's a wonderful time in the world, so I'm gonna do it. So at every level, from individual borrowers to financial institutions, you saw some sort of negative human nature. I won't go through all of this, but essentially what it did was create another loop, another growth loop that reinforced material gain, but in order to gain so much, sometimes you cut corners. And you did things that were a little bit shady. So I start out in the center there with self-interest. Of course that drives human beings. We are all self-interested for survival. It's not necessarily a bad thing if it's balanced. So what happens is that self-interest drives material desires, and that gets us, if we get too much there, we become greedy, then we say, well, that's not enough, so I'll just shave corners here. And so I get something, and because I get something, I feel great, and now my self-interest is piqued. And all of these other things conspire to increase that sense of self-interest. So what would happen, normally would happen to reduce self-interest would be that there's sort of a balancing between self-interest and social interest or care about others. There's a lot of literature on this, but the idea is that we often have moral grounding that says, stop, don't do this behavior, it's not right. And then we have what are called human defense mechanisms, which are justifying your action. If you do something that's not, you take a pencil from work, well, it's okay, it's only a pencil, no problem. And then the next time you take a computer, well, everybody else is doing it, so it's okay for me to do it. So these two things, the moral grounding that we get from wherever, our youth, when we grew up, our religion, our parents, whatever, you have this level of grounding that says don't do that. It's this little angel sitting on your shoulder and this little devil sitting on the other shoulder saying it's okay, don't worry about it. So this is just a way of that I chose to represent what happens in the human psyche. Well, so we have this loop, and then now we have almost what I call a lack of concern about consequences. There were none for some. You could borrow money and it was fine. Nothing happened. You could be a little greedy, or some of the corporate executives, for example, could be a lot greedy, and nothing happened. They didn't get, nobody put them in jail, nothing happened. So this lack of concern said, well, it doesn't matter, everybody thinks it's okay, so it must be okay. And so you get this greed loop that goes on top of the ethics, the attempt to balance your ethics, and then you get this lack of concern. And what I don't want you to focus on is all the S's and O's and all of those things, but the idea is that they're interdependent. It's that you have something that is normal human nature to balance your greediness, and yet if that breaks down and nobody cares about the consequences, and maybe your moral grounding is a bit weak, then you get huge greed, and it just grows and grows. So the outcomes were that borrowers, there were foreclosures, securities investors had huge losses in billions. Interest rates came down in order to stimulate new buying so that the bottom wouldn't fall out of the market. Corporate bankruptcies, bailouts, of course we know all about that, and all the things that happen. Not nice things. And you can see, if you just take a little peek and say, I'm an individual and I bought a home and I really couldn't afford it. And it really isn't my fault because everybody said I could do it and everybody else is doing it, so it's okay. And then the change just starts and it grows and grows, and it grew international. And it wasn't slow in terms of time, actually. Bad outcomes. So tiny things that happen affect big things across the world. Subprime loans, from the time that they originated to the time that they failed was only 3 to 4 years. And in that time, one person has identified 3 waves of failures, 3 waves of why defaults occurred. One of them was because it was the flippers, they call it, people that just had invested in homes just to make money. They found that when prices started going down, they got out, or they just walked away. They didn't even bother to pay it off, it just went into default. And then there were a couple others when the adjustable rate mortgages, the interest rates changed and got bigger, then people couldn't afford it anymore. They couldn't afford the payments. And so they just walked away. And then the banks said, we can't loan you any money to refinance. Your house is not worth what you already have, what you already owe, so we can't lend you anymore. And so more people defaulted, and it ended up in foreclosures. especially the subprimes. I've chosen subprimes here because it was the biggest issue. So there was a big lag, so in the middle, sometimes when you're in the middle of things, you can't see what's happening around you, and that was the very case here. From 2004, when they first started, 2005, when they first started to go down, there's an indicator out there, but many people still denied it and said, oh no, it's no problem, it's just a little hiccup, and so on, but it wasn't a hiccup. So now I get to the grossest thing in the book. It's in chapter 12. Do not, if you read the book, don't start there, because it will just, it just is too confusing. But what I did was integrate, by way of the systems thinking, systems diagram, all of these things that added together to create the crisis. And so, and I'll show you the background of it, which in a moment, but all the way from, it affected economies, the housing and financial markets were working, human nature was working, the environment and corporate health, everything was all tied together. And the way it's tied together is this gosh awful bunch of little whirlpools, essentially, some of which were growth or decay, and some of which were trying to get people to do certain things, certain goals. And so you have a mess. And that's the whole point of the book. You have a mess because everything is connected. And when you recognize that connection, you can understand that individual actions matter. What you do, what people individually do, what the government does, what business does, everything matters. And it all has to be in balance and going toward the same goal, or you get a bunch of whirlpools that will suck you down. So what do you do? And this is the beauty of using this particular tool to look at that kind of an environment. It also points out areas where you can do something. They call it leverage areas, where you can do small acts that would have big effects that because they affect those particular areas that are growth areas or decay areas, to try to stop this frenetic activity. So in the book I also identified 5 areas where I thought had the greatest leverage that we could do, some of which we did do a little bit, and some of which we never thought to do, and we're still not. So they're labeled 1 to 5 here. And what they are is the leverage areas where you got to figure out how to reduce the risk on debt. How do you do that? Well, in many ways. From changing interest rates, from being more stringent on the policies that you have, a variety of things. Securities and derivatives, there was a time when it was fine as a company to hawk yourself. You could borrow as much as $40 to every dollar you had in equity. And some companies, on the hedge funds, for example, they, quote, leveraged their money, $400 of debt to $1 of what they had in their company. It's growth. Something could be done there. More rules and regulations, and people being aware of the fact that what they do matters. These people who do certain things or unethical behaviors, you know, they think they don't have global effects, and actually they do. Unethical behaviors, there are things that you can do there, certainly by people becoming aware, and numerous other ones which I know. And then positive motivation, and this is something, everything else is negative. And the first 3 areas are mostly preventative. They are how, I think, how our policymakers view the world. In other words, self-interest is great. Adam Smith long ago said self-interest regulates the market. And so everything is fine. You can be self-interested and everything will come out in the end. He didn't count on unethical behavior, I think. And the second is that there are some who think that profit is the only motive, the only good motive or corporate purpose. And so these kind of philosophies shaped what we did. We did do some things to reduce debt. to reduce the high-risk subprimes. That was very difficult to get a loan after the breakdown. And we got a few more things in the securities and derivatives market. I understand the new the potential new Fed chairman is looking at strengthening those or upholding them a little stronger than has been done before. And do something about unethical behaviors in corporations. You can't have so much salary, you can't do this, you can't do that. So it's sort of preventing what the philosophy is allowing the open loop or behavior, just unguarded behavior. What had happened here is the government said, well, we trust you, it's okay for you to do these things. It's okay for you to do derivatives and securities because we know you're honest and everything is going to work out. We trust you. In fact, and so there were no regulations. In fact, there should have been regulations. So we're doing that. The last two, the fourth one particularly, that's the positive side of things. And that's, in my opinion, what has been lacking in what we have been doing. This is a difficult one. I'm very much into motivating people from a positive perspective, suggesting that if you can set up your incentive systems and your rewards to give sense of purpose, for example, in people's lives, they're less likely to be so consumption-oriented. So getting into so much debt, because as they get into debt, they search for meaning. This is a little bit of psychology here, but the idea here is to somehow have corporations incentivized differently. Not to the short term, not to narrow focus, but to broaden their focus and to provide a sense of mission, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose, to reduce that self-interested greed. The next is confidence in the economy. That's a tough one. It's also a value. So you have to have some history. It's based on trust. Many things have been tried there as well, but I think it's a great leverage point. And just to illustrate, and again I'll go back into the loops, so don't get grossed out. The idea here, we have this negative thing going on with the ethics and breakdown and greed, and now we don't have concern about consequences, so there are some things we can do. And this is where I add something that says, what can giving purpose, giving meaning to people's work do in this melee of interactions? It's feeling a cause greater than self, and all it means here is that you get that meaningful purpose gets bolstered, and that reduces self-interest in a way that's more consumptive-oriented. And so then it also maybe strengthens your moral grounding. It changes your reward structure to say we're looking at long-term. And so in my opinion, that's a really powerful leverage point, very difficult to do. So conclusions, I felt like there was a lack of balance in the whole system. All of the things were working toward encouraging bad behaviors, and humans are very capable of these bad behaviors. Furthermore, I think because it's such a big system, every person has to take some amount of personal responsibility. And that's how I conclude the book, is look at yourself in the mirror, which was Gandhi's expression, if you want to make change, start with you. So this is how it concludes. I've taken, just as an aside, I've taken it a bit farther and have several things in the working. I've taken the systems thinking into the world of sustainability, which is a very big deal, and now I'm very engrossed in what's happening to society, what's happening to our environment, the same kind of look at a big picture. And I feel like there's a ticking time bomb there that's waiting, not too distant future. And then I'm also working on another project to look at what millennial leadership has to be in the next 25 years, and using that same kind of an approach. A little bit less whirlpoolish, but certainly the dependencies are there. And with that, I'd just like to open it up for questions or comments or whatever. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me there should be another loop in there in all this mishmash, which is political group motivation.
Good point.
This seems to be based on individual activity.
Yeah.
And there's international relations, political relations, and currently in our country, group relations, group activity, which is, I don't know what's ethical and unethical. But it seems like maybe there's room for another little loop or an
Well,
annex.
you are so right. That is a wonderful comment because we're stalled. We're stuck. And it's all because of that. That you have the confrontation and the motivation and the agendas that certain political groups have, and they do skew what happens. That's an excellent point.
Yeah, but even during this whole cycle you're
Absolutely.
talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, excellent point. Yeah.
I started to be a grumpy old guy, and I remember when you used to go down to see the banker, you wore your suit and tie.
Uh-huh.
When you went down to prove that you were worthy of a loan.
Yeah.
And they knew whether you were worthy, whether you were cheating or you kept up your house or whatever. And now all of our major insurance is getting pulled out from under us, our crop insurance, health insurance, mortgage insurance. So the local doesn't really know you. And then your mortgage package would go before a group of village elders that would review it to see if you were worthy enough for the bankers to loan you money. And all that's gone. So we've lost, I think, our moral compass from, we're now all faceless, nobody gets to know you, and the local control over our local money is totally evaporated.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And
So
that is-
should we have more local control and more local say-so rather than government or a nationalized formula?
Excellent comment. I do have a little bit of that in there because it's arm's length. You don't see the face of anybody anymore. All the people in the securities, they didn't know who the loans went to. They didn't know if you were any good. They didn't care. They were giving money, thousands of dollars in envelopes to the underwriters who said, make this happen. What is that? So there was no direct face-to-face, I see you, I trust you. The trust wasn't there. There was no basis for it.
And Pomona First Federal here in town was another example of a major institution that went down the toilet because of exactly what you said.
Interesting. Yeah, Bob.
Karen, in comparison with other sort of postmortems of what went wrong, what I liked about your contribution is the positive motivational aspects, the suggestions for the future. One of the stellar projects that I experienced is called Financial Peace University, where the notion is to re-educate people to the dangers of credit and to attempt to have them live their lives with more integrity, especially with financial wholeness. And I think those are the kind of efforts that could be cited that back up your positivist approach. I think that's where your book and your framework goes leaps and beyond just the here's what went wrong, but rather looking at those critical points, you've identified 5, and especially those where positive human behavior can help temper the negative consequences of the ticking time bombs that are still there and likely to come back. And I'm thinking of one ticking time bomb as sort of the American, I think you called it entitlement to property, right? Often encouraged by the government, including the Community Reinvestment Act and the redrawing of red lines. And as a banker for what I think is a high integrity institution, we were still forced into doing things that really were not good for the system's view. And so those ticking time bombs are still there, but I think some of the work that I hope you continue to do in pointing out those elements, like the positivistic approaches, can help change the mindset and to remind us that, in for example, my mom's day growing up, it was unheard of to be, more than a very small amount into debt. It was considered much more short-term. It was considered
embarrassing.
It was embarrassing to say, oh, I had to get a loan, but I paid it off quickly. That mindset from my mom's generation is largely lost on the youth of today. And so there is a re-education required. It's not coming from the schools. And so maybe the efforts of Financial Peace University and your book will help plant some new seeds.
Well, thanks. I
Great.
like that positive
Kudos.
aspect.
I love all this stuff, as you know. A point of leverage that we had in place was a chairman of the Federal Reserve who had impeccable moral grounding. I'm sorry, his grounding was in Ayn Rand, but his, which is not necessarily moral, but his judgment about the way economic systems work is profound. In 2005, he talked about this wonderful progress. He warned previously about irrational exuberance in stock prices and so on. He talked about, and it's on the record, and I've got a quote, about what a wonderful thing it was that these new financial instruments were making
Yes.
credit available
Yes,
to
I
lower
have that
income
too.
people.
Yes.
Now, this is a man
Yes.
who understood data.
This is Al Greenspan.
Yes, he was extremely empirical. And one of the saddest, and he was the only one after this that took responsibility for the mistakes that were made. Everybody else kind of, it's somebody else's fault. What he didn't understand were the models. The complexity of the derivative models and the CDOs and the CDSs, and how that was all piling up. He didn't understand the complexity. And he didn't understand that where the models were saying we had diversified away risk.
Yes.
That's why, they're spreading it around, giving it away, you just diversify it. The good watch stuff at the back. The models inferred that we had done that. And that equities were no more risky than anything else.
AAA ratings. Yeah.
Yeah, AAA ratings, S&P bought into them.
Yeah.
He made a mistake. There's a key point of leverage in the fin. Now, Bernanke, a student of the Depression, knew that one of the mistakes of the Depression, and this is Friedman's stuff and so on, was cutting back on the money supply that drove us into a deep depression. Now, how to get out of this hole that we're in with all this money floating around, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems
That's
like
going
a
to
good
take
idea.
pain.
Yeah.
And it's going to take sacrifice, and it's going to take the kind of thing, your 5 points all have to come into play, and it's going to take a leader that says, hey, we're like Volcker, and we're going to have to take the pain of this.
Yeah.
And we're going to
That's a
have
hard
to share it,
sell.
and we're going to have to share it.
Yeah. Wonderful discussion. You gave me great ideas. Now I'm going to go home and write some more. Thank you all for coming. I really
Thank you.
Golf clap.
Very interesting.